time for another build in public update on my We Should Watch project. We're going to go through the new functionality that I've added since the previous update. Keep in mind that none of this is styled, so everything kind of looks a little gross, but it's working the way we intended. The first thing we'll look at here is got this sign in button. I'm doing authorization with NextAuth, and it's super easy. It feels like cheating almost. Before we even do anything, this is the actual sign in button component. You can see we're pulling in a couple things from NextAuth. We've got useSession, sign in, sign out functions. This pulls in the session when we have it. And if we don't have a session, we're returning that you're not signed in and give you the option to use the sign in function. If we do have a session, then it shows you who you're signed in as. We access that object and pull the user email from there, and we give a sign out button. The way NextAuth works is in the API in Next, we actually have a ... NextAuth route here. And this is the whole code that we have to put in, where basically we're exporting our NextAuth with the options that we provide. And those options are things like we have a Google provider, so we can sign in using a Google email address. We also have email provider, which if you provide an email, we have NodeMailer installed as well as a dependency. It will mail out an email to that email address and provide a link to sign in. So there's no need for password creation, which is super nice. And I'm using Prisma to interface with MongoDB as my ORM. So we have adapters in NextAuth, and I'm using the Prisma adapter, which makes it super simple to store new users in my database and assign their information where I need. So we're going to go ahead and just click on the sign in button here. And you can see this takes me to a page where I can sign in with Google, or like I said, enter the email. For the email, using NodeMailer, and I have an account with SendGrid, so that will help me send out those emails automatically. And right now it just sends an email just with a link that you click on to sign back in. So let's click on the Google sign in button. I'm going to choose my preferred account here. But before I do that, if I pull in MongoDB, you can see on my users here, we don't have any results. Once I sign in, now our page updates and we see we are signed in as the email address I chose. And if we refresh our MongoDB here, we can see now I've got a user with the information that we selected. Super easy, super simple. Like I said, it feels like cheating. So now let's move on to this component down here. Again, I don't have any styling going on, but what this is going to allow us to do is this is going to allow us to make groups. The whole point of this application, if you haven't watched the previous videos, the concept of this app is to be able to create groups that you have for yourself and significant other, or for friends or whatever, and everyone has access to that group, and you can all add media to that group to keep track of things you want to watch together. My girlfriend and I have been doing this just with a Google Doc and has been annoying, so I wanted to make an application that we could utilize instead of just using a whole list on one document. What we're going to do here is we'll add a group. And before we do that, again, let's go back and look at MongoDB. And you can see I don't have any groups yet, and my user account doesn't have any groups associated with it. That'll update in just a moment. So we're going to add test group 1. We see a loading state, and then we see group created. Again, this isn't styled well, but this is all just for functionality purposes. Test group 2 and test group 3. Now we refresh Mongo, and we can see now my user entry has updated, and we have group IDs array, and here are the 3 groups that we've created. In the group collection, we have the individual groups and a user IDs array. So if we have another user that joins that group, this will be updated in the future. This component isn't too terribly complicated. We're mainly just keeping track of what's going on with that input, and we have a few states here. We saw that loading state, and we have a message, and we also have our user session from NextAuth. We have the send data function. Once we have something in the input and the user clicks to submit, we set that loading state to true, so we get that quick little loading state visible to the user. We pull the email, and then we send our data to our back end to this create group API. We're sending back the email and the group name that we have created. Here's a quick view of the back end. You can see we just pull in the email and group name that we sent over. we find that user, and then we create a new group and assign the user to it. And then we go back and we actually update that user entry so we have that connection on both ends. So let's say we want to search and add some movies to our list. So I'm going to look for some Godzilla movies. I reviewed the search functionality in a previous video, but as a quick recap, what it's doing is it's taking the user input, it's sending it to my backend, which then calls out to external API, the movie database, pulls in results. We move those back up to the front end and we map through those here. So clicking on each one, I reviewed this as well in a previous video, but just as a quick note, I previously had the modal kind of included in the logic here, and I've moved that out to its own component. So here's the basic modal component, which I just created so I can reuse it over and over again, which we also, with this modal component, created a use modal hook. So I don't have to make state for the modal in the parent component every time we choose to use it. You can see in this use modal hook, we have a state for whether the modal is open or not, and we have the functions to open and close the modal. And in the modal component itself, you can see that we don't return anything if it's not open. And then within the modal, we're just returning children inside some div containers, which help control the state of the modal. So let's say now I found a movie that I want to watch and I want to add to a group. We've got this add to group button. So our user is going to go ahead and click on that. And we can see a quick loading state. Again, not styled. It looks a little gross. And then it shows the 3 groups that I am associated with. What we've got here are 3 buttons that I get to choose from now and select what group I want to add this to. I'm going to click group 1. And now I get kind of a refresh there, and I see that there's a check mark there showing that this movie is now added to group 1. So if I go ahead and click out and then click back into this, you can see now if I go to check a movie, I can already tell if it's added to a group or not. The way this is working, let's look first at this add to group button. So my add to group button, we're pulling in some props here from the parent. The parent is our little preview card here, where we have the info about the movie that we've clicked on. We get an ID of that movie, a title, and a poster path. In the parent component, I'm making that into an object, and we're just passing the whole object down to this add to group button component. We've got our use modal hook here, because once we click this add group button, this is another modal component that we're using. Here is our modal. Right, we import our modal component and put this add to group container component in there, which we'll look at in a second. The button just opens that modal and we display here. Nothing too crazy. This add to group container, we see here we have a bunch of props coming in, right? We've got the media info we just had above, and then we define some things like group info and what that means. It's an ID, name, and collection. So your ID of your group, the name of your group, and a collection if you have any media in it. And then the collection is the ID of a movie in your collection and the watched Boolean. So if we go back and if we review our MongoDB information now, if I look at my test group 1, which has this movie on it, now we can see we have, in addition to user IDs array, we have a collection array, which has an object, which is that ID we just talked about, the movie ID, and whether we watch it or not, just a true or false value for right now. If I go and I add another movie to that, let's go add Godzilla versus Kong. Not that great, but a fun little action romp. And if we check and refresh Mongo again, now we can see we have 2 objects in here, the 2 movies that we're talking about, right? And we can also go see that in media, when we add a movie, I'm also collecting some data in my database for those particular movies. I'll be using that later. Here's the media, right? We can see those IDs, the 929, the 399, 566. These IDs are actually just the movie database IDs for those movies. I'm overwriting Mongo's default ID pattern and just using that instead. So let's look at some of the actual logic behind this add to group container, because there's a bunch going on here. You can see we're pulling in the session for the current signed in user. We've got a state for our data, which is either this group info, the groups that we're looking at, which look like this. We have a name, we have an ID, we have the user IDs and the collection. We have a loading state, we have an error state, and we have this add click right now, which is probably going to change in the future, but we'll see. So the first thing we do is we have a use effect, which will load upon the mounting of the component, and it calls this fetch groups asynchronous function, where we set the loading state to true. We make our Axios call to the back end, where we basically make a get call to this API fetch groups, where we only send in the email address of the current user. What the backend is doing here in fetch groups, We accept that current user email, and then we use Prisma to find the unique email address within our database. We instruct Prisma to include any of the groups associated. So if we look back at our MongoDB database, when we search for our user, we're going to find our email address. We see we have the group IDs. What Prisma is actually doing is it's not just sending these IDs, it's populating each of those IDs with the full information for that group. So when we send this information back up to our front end, we're going to get this group name, the ID, the user IDs, which we're not using right now, but the collection, which is important, and we'll be using that in just a moment. So once we have our data back from the back end, we set that data in state, groups.data, and we set loading to false. So if we don't have loading and we don't have an error, we're returning our actual component here, which we're mapping through the data that we set. So we have each of those group entries, all that information will map through each group. We return this group entry component, which we'll look at that in just a second. We see this add button here. Our add to group function lives here right now. What we do is if we click that, it makes another Axios call, a post call this time. We send back the group ID, so whatever that group ID we just looked at here, the media ID, the title of the media, and the poster path. So that comes back here to the back end to this add media route where we accept the information we just sent. We look to see if we already have that piece of media in our database. If we don't, we're going to go ahead and create that media. And then we update the group and we add, we push onto that collection, that piece of media that we created. Okay, so now that we see how that looks, let's go look at group entry and see what's going on there. So here is group entry. You can see we're pulling in the same kind of information that we had from above. We have that media information as well as collection here, right? So the group of movies that are already listed in that group, or I should say the array of movies that are already listed in the group we're looking at here. So we're looking at group 1 as an example, or test group 1. And we define what a collection is. Again, we have that ID and then watch Boolean. These eventually can move out into a different file once I clean this up and refactor some of this information. So group entry here, we've got some font awesome icons going on again. And we have this check if included function. Since we have our collection, let's look at MongoDB for a second here. So let's say we're looking at group 1. We have this array of objects, and that is the collection that we're looking through. And we're going to say for each object in this array of objects, check that ID. And if that ID matches the movie that we're currently looking at, we're going to return true. Otherwise, we return false. So we run that function here and we store the result in check result. And now we use check result to determine what button we should display. Should we be displaying a plus button so that we can add it? Is it not included? If it is included, we get a true value. So we use our ternary operator here. If true, return check. Otherwise, if false, return add. And now in the actual return here, we see we've got our H1, which is just the name of the group that we're looking at. And we have this onClick, which we call back up to the parent component, that add to group function, where we send back the ID of the current group we're working with. And we have disabled here where we check result, right? We use that true or false value to see if we should disable this button, because if it's already included, I don't want to allow the user to click that button again. And there we go. That's how that's all working out for us. The other thing I want to show too is that I've got this view details button here. We looked at one of these detail pages in the previous update where we reviewed the logic behind this streaming section. But what I really want to show off here is I've got a few other things added, just a cast and production staff section. We put in some question marks if we don't have images for people. We've got some recommended titles and similar titles. And here's this add to group button again, doing the same thing in the same way. It is just the same component and we just threw it in there. So we get to reuse that bit of logic on the actual details page. So there you go. That is the update on the functionality. I hope I did a good enough job covering everything that we've added here. If there are any questions, let me know. I'll take a deeper dive into the code and go through it a little slower and go through examples and things like that. But thank you for following along.